Welcome to the Banality of Transformation, a podcast from Future-Proof Fashion. Future-Proof Fashion is a strategy studio working with fashion and textile businesses to design future-fit business models using an interdisciplinary approach. The Banality of Transformation is the name of our most recent research into why large-scale change so often fails. Most transformations don't fall down because the strategy is wrong or the technology was missing. They fall down because organizations rarely redesigned the decision system, the incentives, structures, and feedback loops that shape what people actually do every day. Out of that work, we developed Incentive-Driven Architecture, or IDA, a practical framework for tracing outcomes back to the controlling decisions that drive them, mapping the 5-layer incentive stack around those decisions, and redesigning that architecture so the behavior your strategy needs becomes the easiest, most rational choice. On this podcast, we'll do two things. We teach you IDA so you can bring this lens back into your own organization. And we open up the research and war stories behind it, from the systems and behavioral thinkers who shape the work, to the leaders who live these transformation challenges from the factory floor all the way through to the boardroom.
Hi, I'm Bill McRaith, Executive Advisor at Future-Proof Fashion. I'm going to be talking to you today a little bit about my background. I really have lived in two environments. I would say the first half of my career, 80s, 90s into probably the early 2000s, I was on the manufacturing side, so manufacturing in the UK, apparel, supply chains, and then later on living in China, building manufacturing in China. Ultimately, in most places, the manufacturing is around the world. Second half of my career, really kind of from early 2000s and onwards, has been on the other side of the equation, which is really within large brands, large retailers, primarily in the US, in fact, all in the US, really running either supply chain segments for them or running the whole supply chain as the Chief Supply Chain Officer, and really ended my career within corporate as the Chief Supply Chain Officer at PVH. I have worked in very large organizations, in fact, some of the largest organizations in the world, and recognized the fact that the system is highly complex. Remembering that all of these companies started relatively small, where the owner was effectively able to get their arms around the whole thing, be on top of everything every day. And slowly but surely, these organizations grew, processes were installed, IT systems were installed, what I'd called architecture of the people, who was in charge, what their objectives were, all those things were installed. But as it grew, what was often lost in that was the individuals that were actually doing the work and what actually drove those people to do that work. And I think people then started to become disconnected. So an activity over here was disconnected from an activity somewhere else. And they often pulled in opposite directions from each other, even though both were well-intended, they had just become so disconnected. I think an example I would give you, maybe one of my kind of early examples, I had moved from manufacturing over into a company called Victoria's Secret Stores, where I had become initially the senior vice president, eventually the executive vice president of supply chain. Everyone at Victoria's Secret had woken up in the morning to do a great job, do the best job that they could, help grow the business, do the right thing. Everyone in the manufacturing side had equally woken up that morning to do a great job, grow their businesses, but they were passing each other in what sometimes was a good relationship, often led to conflicts, chargebacks, complaints on delays, air freight costs, etc., all sorts of problems. And my job was to really try and align those things and bring those things together. And it was the first time I really kind of stood back, because up until then I had really managed my own space. But this was the first time I had really looked at a more complex system, the whole value chain, and realized that as much as everybody was trying to do the right thing, the level of disconnects that had now happened across those businesses was resulting in effectively everyone losing out. And as we changed it and aligned things, that really helped Victoria's Secret. One of the things we did in my tenure is we removed chargebacks. That was a huge step to take chargebacks out, because it had been great for us to point the finger and blame someone, blame the supplier, blame a process, etc., and quickly move on. And unfortunately, what we missed was the real issues that were there. So that was my first big experience of realizing how these more complex systems just weren't aligned with each other. So after I was at Victoria's Secret, I moved on to Walmart. And again, phenomenal company. In fact, I would argue that of all the companies that I have ever worked at, Walmart had the most aspirational leadership. And I know it often doesn't feel like that or get communicated like that, but they truly are just a phenomenal company at the leadership level, supported by just incredibly hardworking people and what is a mammoth of an organization at a global level. But think about Walmart, and look at where Walmart is an incredible organization, huge in size, basically second to none out there. And yet look at a lot of the strategies that they have gone about, even over the last 2 decades. And, I'm sure they've had some great successes, but some of their major ones that they have had, entry to Germany, entry to Japan, the UK, etc., some of the acquisitions that they did, Jet.com, Bonobos, etc., and you look at these, and yet these things failed. And you wonder why. Why did those fail? And again, I'm using Walmart only because I worked there. I'm sure there are 1,000 examples in every other company that's out there of where these things have happened. But when you looked at Walmart, they definitely had the right strategies. I think the challenge is, how do you bring those things into such a mammoth organization that is wired to do things, and every day people are turning up to move thousands, if not tens of thousands of units around the world across thousands of stores in the US and again globally out there. And now you're trying to make changes that require in some cases those people to change when no one has actually come along and looked at the individual person and said, does that individual person understand what they have to do different today? And are there reward systems set up to do that? So very, very, very hard. Just one reflection that I remember struck me. I was sitting in my office one day, and Mike Duke, who was the CEO of the global organization, just happened to wander into my office and sit down and start chatting about how things are, how are things going. I think I had maybe been with the company for maybe 9 months in China, maybe 6 months in Bentonville, Arkansas. And he just sat there very relaxed, chatting away, getting to understand who I was, what I was thinking about, what I was trying to do. And I asked him the question, how does someone at your level, $500 billion business at the time, 1.5 million people in the organization, global footprint out there, how do you have the time to sit down and have this type of conversation with me? And his answer was, that's all I have the time to do. I can't make a decision on what product to buy. I can't make a decision on what country to move into. And again, I'm paraphrasing. I can't make those types of decisions. My only job is to make sure that I have people, and those people are wired and connected with the business in a way that they are making those decisions. I don't make any decision on a daily basis. And that really struck me as very different to most CEOs that I had met prior and maybe post, that really wanted to be the decision makers on certain things. They wanted to make that decision, as opposed to, do I have the right architecture? Are people incented properly? Do people understand where we're going? and that those people are then empowered. They have the agency to then go and do and make the decisions that are appropriate to move this organization forward. It was quite an insightful moment for me in my career. What that did, I think, for me is it made me step back. And again, I had been in the apparel industry, albeit Walmart. I no longer was in apparel. I was in a different segment of the supply chain. But it made me step back and really think about, well, what is my job? We often get promoted because we're the best person at the job that we do at the time, and we get elevated up into manager, senior manager, director, and so on. And it was because we were the best at what we did. What we often fail to realize is you go up a level, that skill set that got you often promoted is not the one that's actually going to benefit you here. You have to think more of at a systems level, at an architectural level. Is the architecture right? Is the structure right? Are the incentives right that are in there? And if I spend time thinking about those things, is the direction of the business clear all the way down and through the organization? And if that's where I spend my time, then the people that are within it, they'll manage the day-to-day. People don't fail. No one came to work today to do a bad job, unless it was their last day at work. But no one woke up and said, I'm going to go to work and I'm just going to do a bad job today. Everybody came to do a good job. And it really made me step back and think about, then I've got to dive and understand when things do go wrong, why did they go wrong? What drove that to happen? And again, just a quick insight at Victoria's Secret, we were all too quick to point the finger, specifically at the suppliers, I would say. Back then, right, not the case today, but certainly back then, we were all too quick to point the fingers at suppliers for a late delivery, for a quality issue, whatever. And people would come into my office and explain suppliers done it again. And by the way, I had the same challenge at PVH when I arrived at PVH. I would continually hear it was a supplier, it was a supplier, it was a supplier. Quick answer is, we'll charge them back. What I think most people didn't realize, and again, I was a supplier for first half of my career, I think what people missed was the fact that I built into my costings the fact that I would be charged back. So I didn't lose money. I didn't have a year that I lost money as a manufacturer. I physically built into my calculations a line for chargebacks or for air freight. And so if I never had a chargeback or I didn't have an air freight, effectively the retailer brand overpaid for their behavior. What I stopped was this idea of, let's stop blaming anybody. I want us to dig into why have we had that failure. We need to go back through the documents and find out, did we give the purchase order on time? Was the tech pack actually all done and dusted? Was the sample complete by the time the supplier had to do it? Was the information clear? I want us to dig that deep in on every failure and find out what's going on. Roughly 96% of the time, we were able to track back a failure in delivery or quality to us. Back to me. We didn't get a PO out on time. There was an email waiting for an answer. There was something in the process that had broken down that resulted in that failure. And ultimately, that's what led us to, at least a short period towards the end of my time at Victoria's Secret, of eliminating chargebacks, because the fact that we were dismissing it as someone else's point lost us all of the insight as to why had it gone wrong. And so effectively all we did is kept repeating it and repeating it and repeating it because we never tracked it back to the point of failure. As soon as we stopped the chargebacks and started to investigating the stuff, we were able to put in fixes that stopped the repetition of it going on. And that was something that we carried into PVH. At PVH, we had what was called a crash team. The whole purpose of the crash team was to go in and without pointing fingers at anybody, because again, the principle is everybody came to work today to do a good job. What went wrong? And the crash team would go in, they would track the process, they would look at where the points of failure were, and often it wasn't a single point of failure, it was multiple points of failure in the system on it. And we would identify what went wrong, and then we would correct the process that was in there. And I think we did good work on that journey. We did good work in getting those kind of operating procedures set up. We created what was called a POH. In pilot terms, that would be a pilot operating handbook. In the case of PVH, it was a PVH operating handbook that laid out what do people do, how does it work, how does the overall system work. That was great. I would say the miss, and now that I probably realized it in my role in the organization, and I'll give a couple of other examples of where this kind of jumps out. In my role, I was starting to realize it, but what I never got towards the end was the people element of it. So we typically rewrote a process, or we identified a system issue, that there was a system issue, or there was a process, a documented process issue that needed to be corrected. What we often missed was the elements around the individual person, which is really what IDA addresses, right? Incentive-driven architecture. It assumes you've got the right process, I've got the right tool set, I've got the right systems. But now it looks at what drives the person to do what they do every single day. And there were a few instances, and again, this is extreme and certainly not normal. There were a few instances where we actually saw behavior that to all of us, when we looked at the crash investigation, seemed completely irrational. But as we looked at why was that happening, what we realized is you've typically got these long-term incentives, right? You'll get an annual bonus out there. Well, who cares? I don't know what that will be. I typically worry about it a month before I get to the end of the year. And then at the end of the year, someone comes and tells me what my bonus is, right? But it doesn't really drive me. It's not a driver of my behavior. I've got my KPIs, and certainly I'm conscious of those, but that's a lagging indicator, typically a long lagging indicator as to how I'm performing. The short-term behavior is, did my boss compliment me? When I was in a meeting, how did people talk about my area of the business? What were those immediate feedback mechanisms that were coming at me that were far more important in terms of either lifting me or putting me down, in terms of what I would do next. And they were reinforced over time, right? If I kept getting kudos for an action, then that action would typically be reinforced. And where we often saw some, again, major issues was where that was actually happening, where in a particular case where the person was getting almost immediate feedback from a particular team about the price of the product, and if the person was able to negotiate a lower price, they were getting very positive kudos, positive feedback instantly. If unfortunately the price wasn't matching what the planning buying team needed, then that feedback could be negative. And what we saw was that mattered. That mattered far more than an annual bonus. That mattered far more than a KPI to person is. What was that instant feedback that the person was getting? And that led, in one particular case, down a very negative path out there. But again, very, very unusual. But it opened my kind of eyes to this fact that, again, it reinforces the IDA thing. We often worry too much about, have we mapped out the process? Have we had the big presentation on the strategies? Here's where we're going. This is what we're doing. We're going to open up a new country. We're going to open up e-com. Whatever those strategies are, we're going to change the model that's out there. We do all the big stuff, the grand stuff. We put in the new IT system. We bring in an outside organization to help us implement that. And I think all too often we fail to drop down and say, but at the individual operator level, where all of this actually happens on a day-to-day basis, have I understood the surrounding elements around that person, and have I appropriately modified them, or re-incented or rewired them, so that everyone in the organization is now pulling against those new strategies, as opposed to, I went to the presentation, I heard the CEO talk about these great strategies. Meanwhile, Tuesday, I'm back in the office, head down. I've got to get these tech packs out. I've got to get the purchase orders out. I've got to get these documents filled, because that's what I do every day, and that's what I get complimented on. And quite frankly, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do with the strategy that I just heard about. As much as I loved it, I'm just not sure what I am supposed to do with that and how it changes what I do. So one of the roles in the organization that I actually think has the primary responsibility, in fact, I think all leaders within organizations have to be system thinkers, and system thinkers all the way down to the incentive systems that underlie behaviors of what people do and what surrounds the individual people. And all leaders have a responsibility to that. But if you're not careful, certainly in larger organizations, you can have leaders who are heads of silos, who again, that leader is doing absolutely the right thing within their silo, but those silos happen to be pulling in often different directions within an organization, whether that be, design, what design does, and what they're driving versus what corporate responsibility and sustainability teams might be doing, and they may be pulling in slightly different directions, what planning and what supply chain may be trying to do and pulling in different directions, planning the responsibilities they have, never be out of stock out there. And yet supply chain or logistics or the CFO is trying to reduce inventory in the system. And so there are often conflicts that go on, not intended. Again, no one intends the conflict to happen, but just it was never wired properly. And so I actually think the primary person who has that responsibility, if I think of the CEO, is really leading the charge on here's the direction of the company, and obviously he engages all his leadership, but here's the direction of the company, here's the strategies of the company that we're going to go drive. The key person for making sure those work across the whole organization, I think, is the COO of the organization, the Chief Operating Officer, who has a responsibility to make sure every aspect of that isn't just individually doing a good job, but is collectively wired to do a good job. And again, I've loved all the CEOs I've worked with, but often what I recognize is they have a bias. They have a bias as maybe they're a CFO and COO can sometimes be combined, and so it leans to the finance side. Or maybe their bias is on the demand side, the retail, the e-com side, and that's where they spend most of their time. Or maybe it's on the IT side. So it can be in different places, whereas I think it needs to be, there can be no bias. It has to be across the whole company and making sure the system is rewired. Because a strategy is a change, right? It's not just a declaration. It's a change as to how you operate. And so it's making sure that change permeates all the way down, and all the kind of connections are rewired within there. And again, just to give you a kind of maybe another example, in one organization I was in, one of our objectives was, how do we reduce on-hand inventory, right? Because tying up cash typically resulted in markdowns because we were carrying too much of stuff, or potentially it tied up open to buy, so we couldn't go buy more of the right stuff that we had. So how do you collapse your on-hand inventory right down and free up all of that cash to do other things with? And so a lot of work was going on within the organization to be faster, be more responsive, whether that be new types of supply chains, nearshore, etc. models that were in there. So all of that work was going on to kind of shorten and allow us to be more responsive. There was another part of the organization, and that part of the organization was being heavily applauded, maybe rewarded, if verbally, certainly rewarded, for the fact that they had one of the lowest logistics costs. So they were able to move product at a per unit cost basis from the countries of manufacture into the distribution centers, wherever they were in the world, at the lowest possible cost, right? And that was great. And they were getting applauded for that. There was a metric that was actually put against that. It was held out there as, look how amazing this is. The way that was being achieved was by using the slowest boats that we had. And in some cases, instead of coming eastbound out of China, we were coming westbound out of China, because that would be at a much lower cost, a much lower shipping rate. What it was doing is, it was in some cases adding 10, 15, 20 days to the overall calendar. So it's just an example of where a metric in one part of the organization, and kind of kudos that was being given over here, was in direct conflict to what the organization was trying to do over here. And it wasn't as if either group was fighting with each other. Quite frankly, at that time, they didn't know, right? That this group was doing exactly what they thought they were being applauded for, and were supporting the business achieve its goal of growth and profitability. And this other group was working hard to try and improve that. But they were in direct conflict with each other of reducing time to market. And again, that's why I come back and say, that's where I think COOs have this responsibility to have no bias to any particular part of the organization, but really they are the primary one responsible, with everyone else, to drive and rewire that whole organization across it, all the way down to the individual behaviors of the people within that organization. So with all of that said, and in hindsight, looking back, what was clearly missing was this tool set, this philosophy of IDA, incentive-driven architecture. We overthought the strategy at the highest level. We overthought the processes and the structures. We overthought the IT systems that were needed to implement it. And yet what we missed in all of that, the human system, because that's what companies are, right? That's ultimately what companies are made up of, are human systems. And even in a day of AI and how AI is coming into place, ultimately, companies are still filled with humans making decisions. And what in hindsight, for me, that was missing to a lot of the work. And I would suggest, when you actually go look at a lot of the failures and just go back and reflect on yourselves at the failures, it didn't come down to you chose the wrong IT system. It didn't come down to the strategy was wrong. What it came down to is the inability to integrate it into an organization that probably had been working in a similar way for 30 plus years, and now the strategy is trying to change that direction. I think the beauty of it is it's not just words. It's not just saying, well, we need a human system. Yeah, but I think what IDA does is it creates a framework and a structure around that. How do you come in? How do you attach that strategy? How do you then drive it down through the organization and understand, if that's your strategies, where are the critical points within your organization that a behavioral change is required for that strategy to be successful? And do I actually know where all of those are? It won't necessarily be the whole organization, but there could be hundreds of points that you need to understand where it is critical that changes. And then to come in and look at the individual and look around the individual with a set of principles to understand, have we changed and tackled those? What incents people to do it? Is the tools easy to use? Do they understand the direction that we're going? And really alter that across that company and create almost like a digital twin that allows us to look at it and say, if we do this, will we achieve the outcome that we need? And we just never had that. So clearly missing component of the work that we did. And I think if I had had that, and again, my responsibility, but if I had had that as a team, as a capability to go in and do this, I think far more of our strategies would have been successful